Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow.
So I just about survived that expedition. I got back from traversing Madagascar about 4 months ago. But just before I talk about that, I want to give you a brief overview of some of the travels and adventures and what ultimately led me to do this sort of thing in the first place. So I myself actually studied a BTEC. It was a national diploma in outdoor education. And this was a great course, a 2-year course. But in between year 1 and year 2, I remember the rest of the students were now already looking at what they wanted to go on to do next. Some were looking at the military, some were looking at university. And I remember feeling really confused as to which direction I was going to go in. But it was the BTEC that made me realize, because it's quite hands-on, as well as all your theory, of course, but it's hands-on providing with experience, I realized that I learned far more through experience, and I really wanted to develop myself more and get out there and travel. I wanted to explore the world, put myself in often dangerous scenarios because I'd developed that way from experience. I'd never tried to make the same mistake twice. But this was a lot easier said than done. I was only 17 at the time. I'd never boarded a plane on my own before. So I decided it's important obviously to visualize the end goal, but I decided to section out and tick off each of the boxes needed to be ticked off to make me go ahead with the travels. So I did that in between year 1 and year 2 of the college course. I concentrated on getting my lifeguarding qualifications, in which I passed and found work a couple of months later, enabling me to quit my current job as a waiter, and I was now on a lot better money at that age. And it was on completion of the college course that I then sold my car. I bought a cheap bicycle and I started cycling day in, day out to work, doing about 200 to 240 hours a month. And the funds were coming in. I also met a friend who wanted to go off traveling with me, which was great. I had a travel companion, so we sorted out the visas, the vaccinations, the insurance, the flights and whatnot. And then it crossed my mind that it's all good going out traveling, but eventually I will run out of funds and I will be forced to come straight back, in which everyone would have moved on with their lives and with their careers. So I told myself to get a qualification here in the UK that would enable me to work abroad. And so I did. I concentrated on getting my scuba diving qualifications, from my open water to my advanced and rescue. It was in Wales, it made it cold, miserable, but it was good. I thought, if I can dive here, I can definitely dive abroad in the tropics. And so 18 months to 2 years later, after a lot of hard work, training and planning, I eventually left at the age of 19 to China. And this is me trekking the Great Wall. It was awesome. We got involved with the local culture. But it was only about a month into traveling I realized I'm very much on the beaten track, which isn't a bad thing because you meet people from all over the world. But I just wanted it to be more wild, more adventurous. I had the same photos, stories, and experiences as every other traveler out there. And so me and my friend, we went further down south to Cambodia. We were both sulking on the Mekong River because we had spent way more money than anticipated, and we wanted to take on some sort of adventure. So I suggested to him, how about we get the nastiest and cheapest bicycles we can find, cycle from Cambodia over to Vietnam, and then the entire length of Vietnam. And so we did. We went looking for a cheap and hideous looking bike, in which we found. And this is Elder. My friend's was called Dot. And as you can see, it's got no gears, no suspension. It's got a little bell on the front and a basket. We found string on the side of the road that we were able to tie our rucksack on the back with. The locals were saying it's not possible to cross the border without an organized guide, and that we wouldn't be able to make the entire length on these sort of bikes, in which they could have been right. But we decided it's up for us to at least try it to see whether we can or can't make it. And so we spent about 2 minutes on Google looking at the route, and we left. And in all fairness, it was it was quite a reckless cycle. We had no pump, no puncture repair kit. We had no helmet, no lights or reflective gear for our nighttime cycles. It was mountainous, in which a lot of the time we had to get off the bikes and push them because the pedals kept snapping. And we were chased by dogs, hit by mopeds, dodged by lorries. It was extreme. The last day we ended up cycling 39 hours straight. We made it after over 1,100 miles to be turned down 7 times by different hostels and guest houses. But it was this adventure that was the catalyst. It was now that I realized which direction I wanted to head into. I loved pushing myself. I loved exploring land that I was unfamiliar with. And I wanted to keep these adventures up. So I did. Briefly cutting them short, I went over to Thailand. I crossed the border via the jungle into Burma and learned how to survive in the jungle with a Burmese hill tribe, from berries that act as mosquito repellents to building bamboo shelters, to hunting, to gathering. It was an amazing experience, seeing how they live. I then pushed on to Australia. I had a 12-month visa. I only lasted 3 months. It was too expensive for me. And so I hopped back over to Asia because I missed everything about it, how cheap it was, its food, its lack of health and safety. And so I came back, but this time I went to India. Unfortunately, I didn't even have enough money to buy a permit to trek the Himalayas, so I risked it and had to avoid the Pakistan army. But you can see that I'm on the peak, one of very many peaks. And so this was all good. This lasted a year, but it was now time to knuckle down and act on the plan that we previously had, which was to further develop in our scuba diving and hopefully find work. And I was successful for the next 2.5 years. I was working in Thailand on 2 different islands as a master scuba diving instructor, teaching people from all over the world how to scuba dive, how to deep dive and wreck dive. This was my office practically, and I've always, you see from the training video, I've always tried to push myself physically, and I've always been quite competitive. So whilst I was out there, I was also training and competing against the Thai locals in the local martial art of Muay Thai. And although this lifestyle was great, I started to feel quite restless. All the previous adventures were now playing on my mind. That was my passion, and I encouraged no one to ignore their passion, and I wanted to do something about it. So I got the world map out, and I started looking at countries that I can walk across, because I'd done plenty of cycles before. And I wanted this survival element. I wanted it to be extreme. And so what stood out to me was Mongolia. Mongolia, I didn't know much about, so I started planning for Mongolia. So I thought the best way to go about it is to find someone who's done it before, ask for their tips and advice. But after doing extensive research, there was no evidence to suggest that anyone had walked solo and unsupported across Mongolia's length. But there was evidence to suggest that someone had attempted. It was quite off-putting because this guy was a Navy soldier and a desert explorer, in which I'm neither of those. But I reached out to him anyway and said, what are the dangers? What should I watch out for? And he got back with this big, intimidating list saying you need to watch out for the stagnant water, the dry wells, the drunken nomadic drifters, the grey wolves, the snow blizzards, the sandstorms. And so it was enough to put me off and start looking at another country. But I went back to Mongolia. I thought it can't end there. Just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it can't be done. So I was introduced to a local logistics manager with extensive experience all around Mongolia, And even he told me, I sent a very amateurish email asking if he believes it's possible. And he actually got back saying, no, I don't think it's possible, but he's excited by the project and he's more than happy to help with the logistics. And so this was my route across Mongolia. I couldn't go too close to the borders, unfortunately, because apparently there was a chance of me being shot, which I didn't want. So I went to the most western city in Mongolia called Olgi, across the Altai Mountains, through the Gobi Desert, and up through the Mongolian steppe to the most eastern city called Choibolsan. So it meant I had to give up this life that I had, that I worked so hard for in Thailand. I sold all of my dive equipment, and I took the biggest risk in moving back to the UK in with my parents. And so that brought me back, and then I took trips over here to London, in which I was now surrounded by more people who had been to Mongolia, and it was all quite negative feedback. A lot of people were telling me that it's not physically possible and it's actually a stupid idea, which was mentally breaking me down, of course. But I decided to go for it anyway. So after a year of planning, a lot of training, a trailer which was built in a family friend's back garden, in which I was only able to test it along the promenade. It wasn't the best of terrain. But I went over to Mongolia, just about managed to find sponsorship, and this is the trailer I was pulling behind me. It was 18 stone, or 120 kilograms of all provisions needed to survive. You can see in this photo that the Altai Mountains are now behind me. It took me 3 weeks to get over the Altai Mountains, in which I was told by the locals that there were wolves hunting up ahead and I'd be eaten alive, which wasn't very nice. I was faced by a snow blizzard, but eventually I made it out of the Altai, and I was looking forward to a bit of warmth from the Gobi Desert, in which I didn't get any of that. I just got hailstorms and sandstorms that I had to cover my skin completely for, until eventually it did subside and things started to get calmer. The heat raised, it went to over 40 degrees Celsius. The terrain was soft sand and gravel, making it really difficult to pull this trailer through. I had a minimal amount of water, in which that water was hot water, and I was really struggling to continue. There was no breeze, and in fact, the only shade that I could find was underneath my trailer. It was at this point that I was really suffering. I was suffering from heat exhaustion. I was very quickly suffering into heat stroke, which is usually fatal. And it was completely solo and unsupported. There were no film crew, no support crew, nothing like that. And it was at this point that I realized if I don't keep getting up and pushing myself on, then I could quite easily die out in the Gobi Desert. And this is when all my planning for travels came into play. It's important to visualize again, but I was looking at the small steps because it was just too painful to visualize, making it to the next settlement, which was now 3 full days away. So I looked at getting out under my trailer, strapping up, pushing on, whether I can only cover 100, 200, or 300 meters before resting under my trailer again. I luckily just about did make it to the settlement, in which it took me a good 7-8 days to recover. I was completely off the radar. But I bucked up the courage again, found the strength and motivation to continue, in which I now faced the step. I was a lot skinnier, I was a lot weaker, but the ending was in sight, and after 1,500 miles, 78 days, knocking 22 days off the predicted time, I became the first recorded person to walk solo and unsupported across Mongolia. Now, this spurred on the career in the adventure industry. It had a short documentary on Discovery Channel, Channel 5, and I went on tour around the UK. And I started to plan my next expedition, which is the trailer that you just saw, was Madagascar, the 4th largest island in the world. In terms of land mass, it's 2.5 times the size of the UK. I would be visiting African coastal communities and Asian highland communities. 80% of all plant life and wildlife aren't found anywhere else in the world, so I knew that it'd provide an interesting journey. I've not got much time. I can't go into too much detail, unfortunately, with Madagascar, but I did come across the wildlife with over 100 different species of lemur. So many different wildlife and plant life out there. It's just incredible. And of course, the locals from the most southern tip, walking all the way up through the mountainous central ridge to the most northern tip. We saw a load of different locals. I partnered up with the Lemur Network Conservation and Tourism to help the country. I always believe you must help the country that you're taking on an adventure in or traveling through. But there was difficult times. It wasn't easy. It was 155 days. I did have to face crocodiles, in which I had a lot of river crossings. On some occasions, I had to build a bamboo raft using natural resources to cross fully flooded rivers. I caught the deadliest strain of malaria, in which fortunately I was near a settlement which had transport, and I was taken to the hospital to get it completely eradicated out of my system. I was bitten by spiders, leeches, held up by the military, but no matter what career direction you choose, I guess you're all going to face struggles. You're going to have times when you're mentally and physically breaking, but it's all about picking yourself back up, and it's this that you learn from the most. It's this that develops you, picking yourself back up against all the odds and pushing on to continue. And at times I had to keep very cool, concentrated, until I made it to the most northern tip of Madagascar, becoming the first person to do so whilst summiting the 8 highest mountains. And I guess it doesn't matter if anyone else doesn't see it for you. It's about you seeing it for yourself. You must mentally believe it before you physically go on and do it. Congratulations to all of you again in here, and I wish you all the best of luck in the future. Thank you.
Wow! Oh my goodness. What can I even say about that? Just give it up properly for our inspirational speaker, Ash Dykes. Woo!